Okay. All right, we'll start, and we'll run the whole hour, 50 minutes to an hour, and at the end we'll have an opportunity for you to ask any questions. We will be covering a total of 13 lessons. Tonight's lesson is, according to the Internal Revenue Code, who qualifies as a minister. Next week's lesson will be on self-employed versus employee. The 21st will be on electing out of Social Security or Medicare. January 4th, what is income and how is it reported? January 11th, maximizing the benefit of housing allowance. We'll have a midterm on the 18th of January. The 25th will be a business discussion on business expenses and deductions, etc. The February the 1st will be taxable, non-taxable income, the Deason rule, and the allocation of expenses between taxable and non-taxable. February 8th will be comprehensive examples of various tax return options that we would have. The 15th of February would be IRS audit considerations. The 22nd of January would be retirement planning, sponsored plans, etc. The 1st of March would be current issues in this arena and internal controls. And the 8th of March would be the final exam. The review would have a review session, and an essay paper will be due then. I'll tell you later on what the essay paper will be all about. We're going to start with just a little understanding of what we're talking about. We're talking about federal tax law. Congress passes laws. They become part of the Internal Revenue Code. When they do, the Internal Revenue Service writes regulations to relate to those parts of the Internal Revenue Code. For example, the part of the Internal Revenue Code that relates to housing allowance is Section 107. So if Congress comes in and writes a regulation about that section, it would be a Treasury Regulation 1.107, whatever, to tell us what part specifically they're talking about. And then we have some clarification that comes through various court rulings, which help us understand what the law and the various aspects of the law and the regulations relate to. And we would reference those by whatever court it was, whether it was a federal or a state court or at the tax court itself, the page on which they reference that, and then the year in which that came out. And finally, we have the option. Anybody can send a letter to the IRS and ask for what is called a private letter ruling. You describe your situation, you ask them your question, and they give you an answer. That answer is only binding to the person to whom they gave the answer. We can't look at a private letter ruling and cite it in a court case or in an examination with the IRS as being a precedent. Only if we had asked for that particular ruling would we be able to do that. So the question we're addressing tonight is who qualifies as a minister? And the information I'm giving you right now comes from the regulations, Treasury Regulations 1.1402, Section C, Part 5. They say, the Internal Revenue Code, the tax law says a minister has to be duly ordained, commissioned, or licensed, and engaged in the ministration of sacerdotal functions, the conduct of religious worship, the control, conduct, and maintenance of religious organizations, including the religious boards, societies, and other integral agencies of such organizations, under the authority of a religious body constituting a church or a church denomination. Now, as we talk through that, we'll talk in a little bit about what sacerdotal functions are. I don't think we'll have any questions about what conduct of religious worship is. Controlled conduct or maintenance of religious organizations. So we'll see as we end up this evening that maybe administrators or teachers and some of those sorts of things are qualified as ministers, even though they're not actively doing things religious worship-wise or administering sacerdotal functions, etc. The courts have also added another point, and that is that you are considered to be a religious leader by your church or your parent denomination. This was in a court case in 1987, Wingo versus the Commissioner. And that item is not in the Internal Revenue Code, not in the Treasury regulations. It was added by the courts, and most of the courts have deferred to that as being an additional factor. And we'll look at the 5 factors that the courts use in a few minutes that will tell us exactly what is required as far as them determining whether or not you are a minister. So what are sacerdotal functions? Officiating at weddings, handling funerals. The houses of mourning clearly fall within the phrase sacerdotal functions. This IRS letter ruling cites he was authorized to and in fact did administer sacerdotal functions. He administered the ordinances of baptism, Holy Communion, presided at marriage and funeral ceremonies. The IRS tax guide for ministers says sacerdotal functions would include preaching, teaching, marriages, funerals, counseling, baptisms, and communion. So a lot of times, whatever you may be doing as far as worship is concerned, you're obviously preaching, you're teaching. You may even be presiding at the Lord's Supper table. You're handling baptisms, you're doing some sort of counseling, you're handling marriages and funerals, etc. So those are the sacerdotal functions that the tax laws and regulations are talking about. As we said, the courts have their 5-factor rulings: administer sacraments, conduct worship services, control, conduct, and maintain a religious organization, be ordained, commissioned, or licensed, and be considered to be a spiritual leader. And we talked about that 5th one earlier. It's not in the IRS code. It's not in the regulations that the Internal Revenue Service has written, but it is something that the courts look to. And of these 5 functions, the only one that is essential is item number 4, be ordained, commissioned, or licensed. And the other 4 off them, okay, Brian, have you joined us? I don't see that you joined us.
Can you hear me?
I can barely hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me see if I can turn my speaker up.
I'm just looking for a little clarification on what it would mean to be one of those 3, ordained, commissioned, or the other one.
Okay.
Licensed.
Ordained, commissioned, or licensed. And I'll give you some information, and then we'll have a discussion in about 2 minutes here that will change some of what I just said. Okay? Ordained, commissioned, or licensed is something that the courts and the Internal Revenue Code look to as being something that a religious organization would do, either ordain, commission, or license their ministers. We have situations, for example, have a gentleman who had applied for exemption from Social Security. We'll talk about rules for that in a few weeks, but he applied for exemption. At the time he applied, he was licensed as a minister in a particular denomination. Later on, he became ordained in that denomination. And when he went to court after the IRS rejected his application for exemption from Social Security because he didn't do it timely, he argued that his licensing didn't qualify him as a minister. the IRS and the courts found that it did. So it's terminology that the courts look to, that a lot of the religious denominations will use: ordaining, licensing, or commissioning. So just
are
go
those
ahead.
all things that you have to go and get from like a courthouse or something like that?
No, it's something that would be bestowed upon you. I have a client, for example, who is a minister in, I believe it's Church of God, Lee University in Cleveland, Tennessee. He attended Lee University. He graduated with a degree. He went to work with a particular church as one of their ministers, but at that point in time, he was not ordained, commissioned, or licensed. So it was a specific situation or a specific ritual they went through to provide that process to him. Now,
Okay.
we'll talk, we obviously, and what's your background, Brian?
Well, I'm a manager at a pest control company, but I've been preaching for about a little over a year now at Church of Christ where I live.
Okay.
And I actually visited my mom down in Alabama, and one of your students, Justin, referred me to.
Okay.
So that's
So
what I was
this will be very timely for you as we go through this quarter, because there are some things that you have a 2-year time frame in which to make an opportunity for an election. So we'll talk about some of those things. So you need to hear this fairly soon. You know, you're hearing it at the right time. We in the church do not ordain, commission, or license ministers. So just keep that in the back of your mind. We'll talk in a few minutes about something that will help you to understand that that really is not a problem. I've just said number 4 is required, but we'll talk about some court cases and some rulings in those court cases that will help us to understand what the courts look at when they say that's a required item. The other 4 items, it's a preponderance of the evidence situation as to how much of it you have to do. So, for example, if you are an administrator in a church school or a school of theology, you may not be administering sacraments. You may not be conducting worship services. You may be doing more of items 3 and 5 here, and those then may very well qualify you as a minister. And we'll talk about some more of those situations as we go through. So, as I said, this was the ruling. Item 4, ordained, commissioned, or licensed is required, but the preponderance of the evidence on the other 4 items determines if one qualifies. If the Internal Revenue Code and the courts both hold that being ordained, commissioned, or licensed is a requirement, what about ministers in the church who have no ordaining, commissioning, or licensing body? I don't think either of you, Brian or Justin, have either, but neither of you have been ordained, commissioned, or licensed. So let's look at that issue. A court case, Reader, in 1993 court case, ordained, commissioned, or licensed, they said, duly ordained, commissioned, or licensed did not depend upon the timing or the fact of ordination, but instead depended upon when he assumed the duties and functions of a minister. And let's look at the next court case. This is 1984, Bollinger versus Commissioner, 1984 case in the 10th Circuit, ordained, commissioned, or licensed. They said, not all churches or religions have a formally ordained ministry, whether because of the nature of their beliefs, the lack of a denominational structure, or a variety of other reasons. We interpret Congress's language providing an exemption for any individual who is duly ordained, commissioned, or licensed minister of a church to mean that the triggering event is the assumption of the duties and functions of a minister. So does that help, Brian?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so the courts are saying, yes, one of the requirement, the essential requirement, or the primary essential requirement is you be ordained, commissioned, or licensed. but they're also saying we recognize that there are religious bodies out there that do not ordain, commission, or license. And as such, we recognize that someone who is a minister in those churches, those religious organizations, as at the time they assume the duties and functions of being a minister, have met that criteria. So the courts are giving us that free pass in essence. We don't have to, in order to qualify under the Internal Revenue Code, set up an ordaining, commissioning, or licensing body. We can just do as we've always done and just have men that are willing to serve as ministers who, once they start performing that function as a minister, are qualified under the Internal Revenue Code based on these court rulings that what they are doing qualifies them as a minister. All right, other questions here? Justin, you have any questions?
No, sir.
Okay, just want to make sure you're still with us.
Yes, sir.
All right, the Treasury regulations in section 107, 1.107, and we'll see the citation on the next slide here, gives us 8 examples of things, of services performed by ministers in the exercise of their ministry that would qualify them as a minister. The performance of sacerdotal functions. We talked earlier about what those sacerdotal functions are. Weddings, funerals, worship services, presiding at the Lord's table, preaching, teaching, those sorts of things. The conduct of religious worship. The administration and maintenance of religious organizations. The administration and maintenance of religious organizations' internal agencies. So we've got, for example, you look at the denominational world, and the Southern Baptist Convention, for example, has various functions that they perform administratively. So people who are working in those administrative functions for the organization would qualify potentially as ministers. The performance of teaching administrative duties at theological seminaries. So someone teaching here tonight as a GSOP instructor, what they're doing qualifies them for as a minister. You know, it's not that they have to leave their work as a minister to come do this. The service performed by a qualified minister as an employee of the United States, other than as a chaplain in the armed forces, whose service is considered to be that of a commissioned officer in his capacity as such, and not as a minister in the exercise of a minister. So the service performed by a qualified minister as an employee of the United States or a state, a territory, or a possession of the U.S. or a political subdivision of any of the foregoing or the District of Columbia is in the exercise of his ministry, provided the service performed includes such services as are ordinarily the duties of a minister. So you can be working for a state, you can be working for a county. Now we'll have a little bit discussion later on about some of these issues where you're being hired as a chaplain that you may not be qualified as a minister. Let's look at the last 2 of those examples. Number 7, all services performed by a minister in the conduct of religious worship, the administration of sacerdotal functions, or the control, conduct, and maintenance of an organization that is operated as an integral agency of a religious organization under the authority of a religious body constituting a church or church denomination. And excuse my typographical error there. I'll try to fix that before I teach this for future classes. And number 8, service performed by a minister pursuant to an assignment or designation by his church for an organization which is neither a religious organization nor operated as an integral agency of a religious organization. So those last 2 are somewhat broad here. If you, for example, Well, I'll take David Decker, for example. David works under the eldership of the Piedmont Road Congregation, and we have assigned him to do work for GSOP. Even if GSOP were not a theological school, because we have assigned David to do that work, that is ministerial work that he is doing. If we assign David to do work for an organization that is not a religious organization, he could still be doing work as a minister. Okay, I don't know if somebody, I'm going to stop share just a minute and see if somebody else is. No.
Sorry, my phone is having a
Oh.
kind of meltdown, I think. If
Okay.
I lose you, I'll try and if I do end up missing the rest of the class, how would I get the rest of the information?
I'm not sure. I plan to load it up to YouTube, and we may have lost him. I plan to load it up to YouTube, but I'm not sure how I do that yet. So
Okay.
I'll try to let you know. Okay, let's get down to the next slide. There. All right. So we have some other examples here of people who were deemed by the courts. Hold on, I've got. Hello?
A hard time getting on the internet right now. And do you have this on YouTube?
I'm going to try to put it up on YouTube. I don't have it up there yet, but we are recording it, so plan to put it on YouTube by the time we get done.
Okay, I appreciate that very much.
Okay, Jackie.
So thank you now.
All right. Bye. Excuse that interruption. That was one of our missing members that hadn't been able to get on. So, all right, let's talk about some other examples of people who were deemed to be ministers. We had an author, and even though this author was publishing books, religious books of the nature, and receiving royalties for publishing those books, the courts held in a revenue ruling back in 1959 that this author was qualified as a minister, that the services he was performing. In fact, they said the writing of bona fide religious books or articles by the minister is considered to be service performed in the exercise of his ministry. So you can be an author, and I think of some of our brethren who have over the years authored various publications, either editors or authors. That work is deemed to be work being done as a minister. Chaplain. Now, we talked earlier about the ability, the capability of somebody to be a chaplain and it be considered minister work, except that, as a general rule, if the chaplain is employed by a government or a political subdivision of a government, the income as an employee is not exempt from Social Security or Medicare, and withholding must be made. In essence, he's treated as an employee, except that he potentially can have housing allowance. Now, we'll talk it next week in the employee versus self-employed, that as a general rule, the IRS stance is that a minister is employed for W-2 purposes, for income tax purposes, but self-employed for self-employment tax purposes. So, but then the church is automatically deemed to be exempt from having to withhold income tax. So churches do not have to withhold income tax, do not withhold Social Security and Medicare if the minister is not Social Security or Medicare exempt. The church does not withhold it, but the minister pays it as a self-employed individual. So a chaplain who is an employee of a government entity would not be considered to be a minister for employment tax purposes. He would be a regular employee, but he would be considered a minister for housing allowance purposes, or could be considered a minister. There have been court cases that have come down on both sides of that ruling. Some of them deeming that he is not, that as a chaplain, he is not allowed housing allowance. Some of them holding that he is allowed housing allowance. And we'll talk housing allowance as a reminder, January 11th. And it's probably the best tax break, well, maybe the next best tax break going. Probably the best one is selling your primary residence after you've lived in it for at least 2 years and having a gain of up to $500,000 tax exempt. So housing allowance won't reach those kind of numbers, but a church administrator. We said earlier that church administrators generally are deemed to be ministers, and as such are eligible for all the tax breaks ministers would get. The IRS issued a letter ruling, private letter ruling in 1981 that held exactly that. The next item, a parachurch minister. Have any idea what a parachurch is, Justin?
No, sir.
We'll have a slide on that, the next slide we talk about. So let's skip that for just a minute and talk teacher administrator. Generally, as we said earlier, a teacher or administrator that is doing work for a religious organization would be qualified, service qualified as a minister. And the regulations in Regulations 1.107, specific services include the performance of teaching and administrative duties at theological seminaries. So if you're in a religious school, you can be treated as a minister. If you're an administrator at a church, you can be treated as a minister. And let's look at the parachurch example. A parachurch is an organization established outside of the church which seeks to provide ministerial functions through means other than the church. Examples would include, in our arena, World Video Bible School, for example, or In Search of the Lord's Way, or GBN, as long as those types of works were independent of the local congregation or local eldership. Billy Graham Ministries, for example, would qualify here. He's not an established congregation somewhere doing a work. He's traveling throughout the U.S. and the world doing religious work. That is what is deemed to be a parachurch. So a minister, someone who works there for a parachurch organization, can be deemed to be a minister and is eligible to receive any and all of the tax breaks that a minister would get. And when I say tax breaks, the biggest one is housing allowance. But then there's some other issues that we talked about that we'll get into greater detail as we go through the discussion. There are some people where we have court rulings in cases where they are not deemed to be ministers. Counselors fall in that quite a bit. In both of these letter rulings in 1991, 1992, the people who requested the rulings spent 50 to 75% of their time in counseling and only a minimal part of their time in performing duties such as the conduct of religious worship or the performance of sacerdotal functions. So in both of those private letter rulings, the IRS denied the person treatment as a minister. So that's what I have prepared, ready for any questions you may have. So let me stop the share right here and get back here. All right, any questions?
I did have one, but I was waiting to the end. Let me. I've lost it. I was waiting to the end, and I've just honestly forgot it. I was trying to look back through the PowerPoint and see if it would spark something.
Okay.
But I don't remember what it was now.
Well, let's just briefly jump through what we talked about. We talked about the being ordained, commissioned, or licensed. I think we had a fairly extensive discussion based on that after Brian came in. Talked about sacerdotal functions, conduct of religious worship, controlled conduct and maintenance of religious organizations. The courts added that you have to be considered to be a religious leader by your religious body. We talked about what the sacerdotal functions are: the preaching, the teaching, marriages, funerals, counseling, baptism, communion, those sorts of issues. We talked about the 5-factor the courts used: administering sacraments, conducting religious or worship services, controlling, conducting, and maintaining religious organizations, whether you're ordained, commissioned, or licensed and considered to be a spiritual leader. And then we talked about the courts have then held that even though you're not ordained, commissioned, or licensed, that if you're doing the work and you're part of a religious group that does not ordain, commission, or license, then you can still be deemed to be a minister. That doing the work, in essence, qualifies you under that category. Now, I will state this, and I don't think I emphatically stated it earlier. If you are a part of a group that does require that you be ordained, commissioned, or licensed, you do not qualify unless and until you reach that ordained, commissioned, or licensed status by that organization. So there are religious groups out there, and I cited a client of mine who went to Lee College, Church of God, and they require that you be. So until such time as he received his ordinance or commissioning or licensing, he did not qualify as a minister. And they treated him as any other employee of the church until that happened. And then they started treating him as a minister, which was entirely appropriate under Internal Revenue Code, under the tax laws. Then we talked about the 8 examples of services performed by a minister. And remember, the primary requirement is ordained, commissioned, or licensed, or if you're not in a body that does that, you meet that qualification by doing these functions. And these things are examples of things you would do as a minister. And then we talked about the other examples: writing books, serving as a chaplain other than in the armed forces, serving as an administrator or parachurch minister or teacher administrator. All right. But that didn't trigger anything?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, if you think of it later, you can send me an email, or you can hold it for next week, and we will meet hopefully next week. I'll be more set up and more prepared and better ready to start on time. So we'll plan to start at 6:30 Eastern time. And I know you're in Central time, so that just makes it a little earlier for you to get done.
That works great for me. I get supper a little earlier.
Okay. So where's Brian from? He's in
Missouri.
Missouri. Okay. Which part?
I know I met Brian just recently. He is in the Ozarks area of Missouri.
Okay. Well, I hate that our other two guys didn't join us tonight, but I will try to post this on YouTube. So once you get, if you want to go back through it and see if something else triggers the question that you may have had, that would be fine. Otherwise, unless you've got questions, we'll plan to start about 6:30 next Tuesday or next Thursday night. Okay. And we'll be talking about, and I'll try to get this schedule fixed up and email it out to y'all as well. Self-employed versus an employee and the IRS stamps on that and why you should be receiving a W-2.
That sparked it. It. So from the church, should we get a W-2 or a 1099?
You should get a W-2.
Okay. Yes, sir. Okay. I just want to make sure. When I was part-time, I would get a 1099, and now that I'm full-time, I get a W-2. And I wanted to make sure.
It shouldn't matter. You should get a W-2 regardless. And we'll talk through that next week as far as the difference and what difference it makes in your tax liability. Because technically, and we'll have a 20-point questionnaire that we'll go through next week that as you start answering, even if you were a part-time person, I think you'll agree that you were an employee.
Yes, sir.
We'll talk through all those issues, but yeah, as a general rule, and I understand a lot of churches still issue 1099s because they think it's easier, but we'll see an example of a W-2 next week, and I think you'll agree there's not a whole lot on it. Box 1, your salary, which is reduced by your housing allowance, and box 14 has your housing allowance in it, and that's all that shows up. So it's just, I mean, the problem with sending you a 1099 is they don't have anywhere to put your housing allowance on it. So, how do you deal with that issue? Do they give you a number with housing allowance included and you have to figure out, and add it out, subtract it out? But yeah, we'll talk through the IRS stance and the tax laws and those sorts of issues. We'll talk through the 20 points that the IRS in an audit would look at to decide whether or not you were an employee or self-employed. And you'll actually wind up, we'll talk about you're really both. But we'll do that next week. And like I say, I'll try to print all this up and send it out so you'll have an idea as to what else we'll be talking about. So, any other final questions?
No, sir.
All right. Well, we will end for tonight then, and I'll try to get this posted up to YouTube. And if you want to review it, that's fine. And then we'll go from there. Thank you. We'll see you, Justin.
Yes, sir.